it has pulled back the veil on the vulnerability that goes beyond all frontiers. Also, the pandemic has awakened the risk of greed, slowness to offer solidarity responses to global problems. And this is why I want to stress before this assembly our conviction that the vaccines against COVID-19 must be global public assets. Argentina celebrates the proposal of patents in the context of the World WTO with a view to contributing to promoting production, competency, and local development of vaccines. With public policies focused on decisive support to research and development, from our country, we have managed to integrate ourselves to the global productive change of 2 international vaccines, and we now have production capacity of the entire cycle, which enables us to incorporate new developments. Of course, this is also now about not just addressing the consequences of the pandemic in healthcare terms, but also focusing on it in terms of reconstructing the social and economic situation, which goes hand in hand with caring for our common home, the planet. Our commitment to the Paris Agreement is full, with a transition towards renewable energies, the adoption of clean technologies for reduction of methane emissions, eradicating illegal deforestation, and the restoring of our ecosystems. All of these commitments are a step more towards a path for our country which is consistent with the goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius and carbon neutrality by 2050. But I'd also like to stress here that none of this will be possible if we do not address the Damocles sword of global inequity, the reconfiguration of the international financial architecture. As was said by the Secretary General, it's quite frankly painful that in 10 years we have not been able to make concrete the commitment of providing $100 billion for developing countries for action against climate change. Climate justice will be a mere chimera without financial justice and positive global imposition, which would contribute to real social justice. And much more so in the context post-pandemic, when the latent risk of a debacle, which would be generalized in the form of external debt for developing countries. Latin America and the Caribbean, for example, set aside 57% of their exports for the servicing of the external debt. And I mention the topic of the foreign debt, which is particularly painful for Argentina. Argentina, which is a country which has been subject to toxic and irresponsible indebtedness with the International Monetary Fund. For the world to grasp the magnitude of debt side, let me just mention one figure. The resources approved by the IMF for Argentina with this unsustainable debt were of $57 billion, the equivalent of what the body dispersed during the years before the pandemic for 85 countries around the world, the same amount. Let me reiterate. In 1 year, they gave us the same amount almost as what was given for the entire year of the pandemic for 85 countries. There is no technical rationality or reason, no ethics, no logic, no political sensitivity which could justify such an aberration. And what's worse is that a great part of these resources are supplied to Argentina, then fled the country through irresponsible opening of the capital account. This case of what I call the debt side, as in homicide by debt, clamored by the global financial world, stressed the results which are key for rescuing the principles of sustainability of the debt, which have been discussed and agreed in the United Nations according to Resolution 69/319 of the year 2015. That is why we support the idea of driving forward inclusive multilateral agreements that would be able to address comprehensively all the issues that are referred to under restructuring sovereign debts. We understand the prerogative of the initiative of suspension of debt servicing produced by the G20, which is, while worthwhile, a temporary and insufficient measure. It does not address the issue of alleviating and restructuring the unsustainability of debts in an in-depth manner. Likewise, the lack of a multilateral framework for restructuring the debt for the debts of middle-income countries continues to be an important gap in international financial governance. This is why we would encourage expanding a new common framework for grappling with the debt by the G20 towards middle-income countries which are vulnerable. We also propose the qualification of credit risk for countries today, which is in the hands of just a few private agencies, be part of the agenda of reforming the international financial architecture also. And in exchange, while it's difficult, is not impossible. We celebrate the expansion and distribution of the special drawing rights of the IMF, an initiative which has opened the door to hope. What a year ago was unthinkable is today a reality. The issuance of the SDR should provide a great environmental solidarity pact, which would include low-income countries as well as middle-income countries who are highly vulnerable both in terms of climate and finances. It would be a pact or a covenant that would make it possible to extend the timelines for payment of debts and application of lower interest rates under current circumstances of financial stress, health stress, and environmental stress. We must promote financial systems which are sustainable, that promote mechanisms for payment and servicing which are ecosystems and involve the concept of environmental debt. The debt by climate is a virtuous step that we must take in the right direction. Capitalization of multilateral development banks, applying resources based on countries' contributions is also an urgent task. It's necessary also to deepen the discussion on a new minimal global tax. What was defined by the G7 and the G20 is a first step that they have taken, but it is insufficient for favoring emerging economies. What is required is to work on a solidarity-based scheme or plan that would be then a reality and make it a reality to actually fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals. Distinguished colleagues, the crisis of COVID-19 is also a crisis of human rights. The pandemic has made more acute violence against women, exacerbated stigmatization of migrants, Afro-descendants, ethnic minorities, LGBTIQ plus persons, senior citizens, persons with disabilities, and it has led to a huge impact on Indigenous peoples. We have the challenge before us of building a new beginning for more fair, inclusive, and equal societies. Prevention and early warning of situations that could lead to massive violations of human rights or early warnings of crimes against humanity or genocides should be one of the major efforts of the United Nations. Argentina is firmly committed to advancing towards universalization of the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons against Forced Disappearances, which is a crucial instrument to fight impunity. Currently, we are working, along with France, on a third campaign of universalization of the convention so that more states will ratify it, with a view to achieving 100 ratifications by the year 2025. Argentina also assumes with responsibility historical demands in terms of the women's movement and diversity. This is a commitment that's reflected nationally, and its maximum expression is the creation of the Ministry of Women, Gender, and Diversity. With the passing of the law of legalizing abortion, the Argentine state has taken on the responsibility of legislating and protecting with public policies the health and life of women and persons with other identities, gender-based identities, with the capacity to gestate. Also, we have passed a law for attention and integrated care of healthcare during pregnancy and early childhood, which broadens the benefits and rights and guarantees attention for health care for women at every stage of pregnancy and for boys and girls in the first years of their lives. The Argentine government decided to reinforce attention for women who are victims of violence, and at the same time it has enacted legislation with a gender focus and worked on it in the area of labor and social policies. It is also promoting shared responsibility with a more fair distribution of tasks in terms of care. With regard to diversity and rights, we have made progress in historical measures of expansion and recognition of rights, such as the approval and enactment of the law on labor for trans populations, which stipulates that the national state must guarantee a minimum of 1% of the labor force for transsexual, transgender, and other. And the decree provides for the emission of national documents, identity documents that would recognize non-binary identities. May I now turn to the scourge of terrorism. Argentina would like to highlight the work of the Office of the United Nations Against Terrorism and in its support of states in applying the global strategy, irrespective of respecting of international law and human rights, international humanitarian law, and the international law of refugees. 27 years after the attack on the Mutual Association of Argentine Israelis, we see a continuation of the policy that began in this area in 2003 and which continued subsequently to require the authorities of the Islamic Republic of Iran to cooperate with the legal authorities in Argentina to make progress in the investigation of the attack. We would reiterate our request to the international community to meet with the requirements set forth in the red cells, the Interpol, and the possible presence of an accused on their territories, something that Argentina has never stopped claiming. Colleagues from around the world, with regard to the Summit on Food Systems, an event which I would like to applaud, I must say that the topic, in my view, is of the greatest importance, not just for Argentina, but for all of us, given our condition of producers and exporters of healthy food, nutritious food for the entire world. We believe that the transition towards sustainability of production systems of food needs to be gradual and according to the form and time as decided by each country based on its productive economic and social reality. There is no single model for development that serves all nations of the world, so it is key to have an inclusive vision of sustainability for food systems with solutions that are adapted to the realities on the ground, social needs, and with the backing of sound scientific evidence. Finally, I would now like to turn to a topic which is of the greatest importance for our nation. The Republic of Argentina reaffirms its right of legitimate sovereignty, which are unavoidable with regard to the Malvina Islands, Georgia of the South, Sandwich of the South, and the surrounding maritime space, which are part of the Argentine national territory. These territories are currently illegally occupied by the United Kingdom and have been since for some 188 years now. There is no reason except the intention of the United Kingdom to maintain the clearly colonial and illegitimate situation so that a bilateral dialogue on the Malvinas issue is not resumed. The request of Resolution 2065 of the year 1965 has remained in effect, and it has been renewed on multiple occasions. And more recently, it was renewed by adoption by consensus of the new resolution on the matter by the Special Decolonization Committee on the 24th of June. The United Kingdom persists with its attitude of refusing to hear the call for a renewal of negotiations with regard to the disputed territory, and has exacerbated the dispute by calls for the illegal exploitation and unilateral exploitation of renewable natural resources and non-renewable resources in the area, action which runs contrary to Resolution 31/49 of this Assembly. It also insists with the unjustified and disproportionate military presence on the islands, which does